The Eastern Front. Winter. A place where metal froze, engines stalled, and soldiers vanished into white silence. But in that frozen nightmare, Soviet engineers created one of the strangest anti-tank weapons of the entire war. A simple wooden sled, loaded with explosives, pushed by hand toward German armor. No engine, no guidance system, just momentum and a soldier brave enough to launch it. It looked like a piece of firewood transport, but once it hit the ice, it turned into a silent, unstoppable bomb. A weapon so primitive and so terrifying that most historians never even mention it. But here's the crazy part. This bizarre invention wasn't some desperate last-minute trick. It actually worked, and today almost no one even knows it existed. Before we dive into how the Soviets turned a child's sled into a tank-killing weapon, a quick note. If you love discovering forgotten battlefield inventions and insane wartime engineering like this, make sure you're subscribed, because the things coming next are even stranger. Now, let's go back to the front and watch this suicide sled come to life. The Eastern Front during winter wasn't just cold, it was a mechanical graveyard. Engines froze solid. Fuel thickened into sludge. Tanks stalled in the snow, their steel armor turning brittle in temperatures that plunged below 30 degrees Celsius. But German Panzer divisions still pushed forward, using frozen rivers and lakes as natural highways. For Soviet infantry, this was a nightmare. Flat, open ice meant no trenches, no cover, nowhere to hide. And every dark silhouette on the horizon was a tank coming straight at them. The Red Army needed a way, any way, to stop that moving steel. But anti-tank rifles struggled against thick winter armor. Artillery was hard to haul across deep snow. And mines? Mines were nearly useless on smooth ice, where the explosive needed pressure to ignite. So commanders turned to their engineers, not for something advanced, but for something that could work in those impossible conditions. And in the middle of that desperate winter, engineers noticed something obvious, something everyone else overlooked. On frozen lakes, anything could glide. A crate, a helmet, a chunk of firewood. It didn't matter. If you pushed it hard enough, it would slide for tens of meters with almost no friction. Suddenly, a crazy idea didn't seem so crazy anymore. What if you could use that perfect glide, not to carry supplies, but to deliver a bomb under a tank? In a place where artillery failed and mines were useless, this simple thought was enough to spark one of the strangest wartime inventions the Eastern Front would ever see. Soviet engineers didn't have much. A few planks of wood, scrap metal, and crates of TNT. But that was enough. They began experimenting with small wooden sleds, the same kind used to carry ammunition or wounded soldiers across the snow. If a simple push could send an empty sled gliding across a frozen river, then what if you loaded it with explosives? It wasn't elegant, it wasn't precise, but it could reach a tank. And that was all they needed. They strapped bundles of TNT onto the sled's frame, sometimes adding metal fragments or spare bolts to increase shrapnel. Then they wrapped the whole thing in cloth to keep the charge stable in the freezing cold. Some accounts claim that the cloth was occasionally soaked in kerosene, not for dramatic effect, but to create a sheet of burning fuel that could ignite the underside of a tank's engine compartment. The idea was brutal, improvised, and very Soviet. Next came the question of delivery. The sled had no engine, no detonator triggered by remote signal, nothing advanced. So, how do you get it moving? You push it. Hard, across the ice, toward a tank. Once set in motion, the sled used the frictionless surface as its engine. If soldiers timed the release right, the device would slide silently under the advancing Panzer and detonate using a simple impact fuse. A weapon launched with nothing but human strength and winter physics. But designing the device was the easy part. Using it in battle was something else entirely. To understand why this weapon was so terrifying, you have to picture the battlefield. A sheet of ice stretching for hundreds of meters, no cover, no obstacles, no sound except the wind. A tank rolling across that surface echoed like thunder. But a sled? A wooden sled sliding on ice made almost no noise at all. This was the key. When Soviet soldiers pushed the sled forward, it didn't lurch or bounce. It simply glided, smooth, steady, silent. From a distance, it looked like a forgotten supply crate drifting across the lake. But inside that crate was enough TNT to tear the belly out of a Panzer. Once the sled gained momentum, the soldiers dropped flat onto the ice or dove behind snowdrifts. They had only seconds before the tank's machine gun swept the area. But the sled didn't need guiding. The ice did the work. If the timing was right, the device would travel dozens of meters, passing directly into the tank's path. And here came the deadly part. Tanks on ice could not stop quickly. Even if the crew spotted the moving sled, braking only caused the vehicle to skid forward, sometimes directly over the bomb. Under the tank's belly, the armor was thinner, much thinner than the front or sides. A detonation there was catastrophic. Fuel lines ruptured, turrets jammed, tracks tore apart. Sometimes the belly plate simply ripped open like a tin can, and the crew inside didn't stand a chance. But even this wasn't the most frightening part. The sled used a primitive impact fuse, which meant the bomb didn't always wait for the tank. If it hit a bump, if the ice cracked, if the charge tilted even slightly, the explosion could trigger early. A weapon that was silent, effective, and wildly unpredictable. Yet, despite the danger, soldiers kept using it, because for many of them, this strange sliding bomb was the only thing that could stop a tank in the middle of a frozen battlefield. For all its ingenuity, the suicide sled had one brutal flaw. It was just as dangerous to the people launching it as to the tank it was meant to destroy. The soldiers pushing the device had to step out onto open ice, fully exposed, often within a few hundred meters of an advancing Panzer. Machine guns mounted in the turret could sweep the ice clean faster than a man could run. If the crew spotted the soldiers, the launch team likely didn't survive. But even if they avoided enemy fire, another threat loomed. The sled didn't always travel in a straight line. A gust of wind, a patch of rough snow, a slight tilt, that was enough to knock the sled off course. More than once, according to frontline accounts, the bomb missed the German tanks entirely and began sliding back toward the Soviets who had just launched it. Imagine the horror of watching your own explosive drift silently toward your trench, gaining speed, unstoppable. Some crews were forced to scramble out of hiding and sprint onto the ice, desperately trying to knock the sled off its path before the fuse triggered. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they didn't. Even when the sled did reach the tank, timing was everything. The impact fuse could be too sensitive, exploding prematurely on a small bump, or not sensitive enough, requiring a perfect collision to detonate. And then, of course, there was the ice itself. Thinner sections could crack under the weight of a tank, or under the shock wave of the blast. When that happened, both the sled and the men launching it risked falling into freezing water. Death by bullet was quick. Death by the ice was not. Every launch was a gamble. Push the sled too late, and the tank overruns you. Push it too early, and it won't reach the target. Push it just right, and you might live long enough to watch the explosion from behind a snowbank. It took courage, it took timing, and it took luck, sometimes more luck than courage. Yet despite all these deadly risks, the sled continued to be used, because on the frozen battlefields of the Eastern Front, there simply wasn't anything better. The strange thing about the suicide sled is this: Despite its terrifying simplicity, very little official documentation survives. It wasn't a standardized weapon, it wasn't produced in factories. It didn't get a manual, a blueprint, or a formal designation. This wasn't the T-34, this wasn't the Katyusha. This was a field invention, born in snow, used in desperation, and forgotten the moment the ice melted. But scattered frontline reports and testimonies paint a clearer picture. During the brutal winters in Karelia and around Leningrad, Soviet units frequently faced German armor advancing across frozen lakes. Artillery couldn't be dragged into position fast enough. Anti-tank rifles were nearly useless in sub-zero conditions. So, sappers improvised, and the sleds started appearing. One documented incident describes a Panzer III leading a column over a broad sheet of ice. The crew saw something ahead, a small wooden object sliding toward them. At first, they assumed it was debris. Then they opened fire, but bullets did nothing. The sled simply skimmed across the ice, light and fast, bouncing away from the shots. Moments later, it vanished under the tank's belly. The explosion shattered the track, blew out the suspension, and dropped the Panzer into a crater of broken ice. The rest of the column halted immediately. The silence that followed echoed across the lake. Other accounts mention German crews becoming wary of sliding objects on frozen terrain. At least one diary entry from a Panzer commander refers to them as gliding mines. But the Soviets never used them in massive numbers, only where conditions allowed. That's the irony of the whole invention. It was incredibly effective, but only on perfect ice. The moment the battlefield turned slushy or uneven, the weapon became useless. Still, in those rare moments when everything aligned, smooth ice, advancing tanks, a well-timed push, the suicide sled delivered results far beyond what anyone expected from a device made of wood, rope, and a pile of TNT. And every time one of these bombs slid into position and detonated under a Panzer, it sent a message across the front. Even on the coldest, emptiest battlefield, the Red Army would find a way to fight back. For a weapon that could destroy a tank with nothing but wood, rope, and winter physics, the suicide sled left almost no footprint in official history. No museum models, no preserved prototypes, not even a clear blueprint. It vanished as quietly as it operated. Why? Because the sled existed only in a very specific moment, a moment when the battlefield was nothing but ice and desperation. Once spring came, the frozen rivers cracked open, the snow melted, and the sled instantly became irrelevant. A summer battlefield offered no clean, frictionless runway, and no reason for such a weapon to survive. The Soviet military preferred weapons that could be mass-produced, standardized, and documented. The sled was none of those things. It was a field improvisation, the kind of invention armies rarely celebrate. It didn't win battles by itself. It didn't fit into propaganda posters. And it relied on conditions that existed only a few weeks each year. So it was never given a name, never cataloged, never turned into doctrine. Just a tool soldiers used when they had nothing else. Today, most of what we know comes from scattered diaries, personal testimonies, and a handful of unofficial reports. Fragments of memories, almost lost to the cold. Stories told by survivors who watched a wooden sled glide across a frozen lake and change the course of a battle. It's a reminder of something important. War isn't just fought with the weapons nations designed. It's also fought with the weapons soldiers invented on the spot, in the snow, with whatever they had. And that's why the suicide sled remains one of the strangest, most forgotten anti-tank weapons of the Second World War. A ghost of winter warfare, remembered only by those who saw it slide silently toward a tank and never return. So that's the story of the suicide sled. A weapon so primitive it looked like firewood, yet so effective it could rip open the belly of a Panzer, born from cold, desperation, and the brutal logic of survival. Thousands of Wu inventions are remembered. This one slipped through the cracks, just like it slid across the ice. And if this bizarre sliding bomb surprised you, wait until you see what else soldiers built on the front lines. There were weapons even stranger, even riskier, even more unbelievable. Next time, we're diving into another forgotten Soviet anti-tank invention, one that was even more dangerous than the Molotov Sled, and required far more than just a push across the ice. Trust me, you don't want to miss that one. If you enjoy uncovering these lost battlefield stories, the ones too strange for textbooks, make sure you're subscribed, because there are dozens more inventions like this waiting just below the surface, and we're only getting started. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.